The entire studio froze. The microphone went silent. And for the first time in Simon Cowell's history on television, he couldn't speak. It wasn't because of a technical malfunction. It wasn't because of a controversial act or a shocking performance. It was because of something far more profound, something that stripped away every layer of the harsh judge persona he'd built over decades. On that stage stood a 72-year-old man named Robert, holding a canvas that told a story Simon never expected to witness. And in that moment, the world saw a side of Simon Cowell that cameras had rarely, if ever, captured. This is the story of the performance that changed everything. Not just for Robert, not just for Simon, but for everyone who witnessed what happened that night on America's Got Talent. The auditorium lights were blazing as they always do during America's Got Talent auditions. The energy was electric, the audience buzzing with anticipation for the next act. Simon Cowell sat at the judges' table, arms crossed, wearing his signature black V-neck shirt and jeans. His expression was neutral, almost bored, the look of someone who'd seen it all. Beside him, Howie Mandel cracked jokes with the crowd, while Sofia Vergara laughed at something on her phone. Heidi Klum sipped water, casually flipping through her notes. Then the stage manager's voice echoed backstage. "Next act, you're up." Robert stepped forward slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the canvas he carried, a large frame covered with a white cloth. He wore a simple gray cardigan over a button-down shirt, the kind of outfit a grandfather might wear to Sunday dinner. His hair was silver, neatly combed, and his face carried the deep lines of someone who had lived a full life, one filled with both joy and sorrow. The audience quieted as Robert walked to center stage. There was something about him, something gentle yet profoundly sad, that made people instinctively lean forward in their seats. Simon glanced up from his notes, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the elderly man. "Good evening," Simon said, his tone flat but not unkind. "What's your name?" "Robert," the man replied, his voice soft but steady. "Robert Harrison." "And what are you going to do for us today, Robert?" Robert paused, his fingers tightening around the edges of the covered canvas. "I'm going to paint," he said simply. The judges exchanged glances. Howie raised an eyebrow. Sophia tilted her head, intrigued. Heidi smiled politely. But Simon's face remained unreadable. "Paint," Simon repeated. "On stage. Live." "Yes," Robert nodded. "But it's not just about the painting. It's about who I'm painting for." The audience fell silent. Something in Robert's voice, something raw and unguarded, had shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. Simon leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "Who are you painting for?" Robert's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "My wife," he said quietly. "Her name was Eleanor. She passed away 6 months ago." The air in the auditorium became heavy, almost sacred. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the cameramen seemed to pause, their lenses focused entirely on Robert. Simon's expression softened, just barely, but enough to be noticed. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and for once, there was no sarcasm, no edge. Just sincerity. "Thank you," Robert replied. "Eleanor was an artist. A painter. She taught art for 40 years. And in all that time, she never let me paint her. She always said she wanted to be behind the canvas, not in front of it." He smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. "But now that she's gone, I wanted to try. To paint her the way I see her. The way I'll always see her." Howie Mandel, known for his quick wit and humor, was silent. Sofia Vergara's hand had moved to her chest, her eyes visibly moist. Heidi Klum blinked rapidly, clearly fighting back tears. But it was Simon who surprised everyone. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make a quip. He just nodded slowly and said, "Show us." Robert placed the covered canvas on an easel that had been set up on stage. Beside it was a small table with brushes, a palette, and tubes of paint. He took a deep breath, removed the cloth, and revealed a blank white canvas. The lights dimmed slightly, leaving only a single spotlight on Robert. The audience was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the stage lights. And then, Robert began to paint. His hands moved slowly at first, deliberately, as if every brushstroke carried the weight of a memory. He dipped his brush into deep blues and soft grays, creating the outline of a face. Then came the warmth, touches of pink and gold, the suggestion of a smile. His movements were not those of a professional artist. They were rough, uncertain, imperfect. But they were real. As he painted, a voiceover, Robert's own recorded voice, began to play softly through the speakers. Eleanor and I met when we were 19. I was studying engineering. She was studying art. I thought I knew everything back then. But the first time I saw her paint, I realized I knew nothing about beauty. She could take a blank canvas and turn it into a world. She made me see things I'd never noticed before. The way light falls on water. The way shadows tell stories. She taught me that life isn't about perfection. It's about presence. Simon's jaw tightened. His eyes never left the stage. The voiceover continued. We were married for 50 years. 50 years of laughter, arguments, forgiveness, and love. She painted hundreds of pieces. Landscapes, portraits, abstracts. But she never painted herself. She said her beauty wasn't in how she looked. It was in what she created. Robert's brush moved faster now, adding details. The curve of a cheek. The softness of eyes. The hint of a smile that seemed to glow even in its unfinished state. When she got sick, she made me promise something. She said, Robert, don't stop living. Don't stop seeing beauty. And don't be afraid to try. So here I am. Trying. The painting began to take shape. It wasn't perfect. The proportions weren't exact. The colors weren't blended the way a professional would blend them. But it was unmistakably her. Eleanor. A woman with kind eyes, a gentle smile, and a presence that seemed to radiate from the canvas. And then something happened that no one expected. Simon Cowell stood up. The audience gasped. Howie, Sophia, and Heidi turned to look at him, confused. Simon never stood during an audition. Not for singers, not for dancers, not for anyone. But he was standing now, his hands gripping the edge of the judges' table, his eyes fixed on Robert. Robert didn't notice at first. He was too focused on the painting, his hands moving with a kind of desperate love, as if each stroke could bring her back, even just for a moment. Simon walked slowly around the table. The cameras followed him, unsure of what was happening. He stepped down from the judges' platform and began walking toward the stage. The audience was completely silent. Even the other judges were frozen, watching in disbelief. Robert finally looked up and saw Simon approaching. He stopped painting, his brush hovering in midair. Simon stopped at the edge of the stage, just a few feet from Robert. For a long moment he said nothing. He just looked at the painting. Then he looked at Robert. And then, in a voice so quiet the microphones barely picked it up, Simon said, "Tell me about her." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "She loved mornings," he said, his voice breaking. "She'd wake up before the sun and sit by the window with her coffee, just watching the light change. She said that's when the world was most honest. Before it woke up and started pretending." Simon nodded, his own eyes glistening now. "What else?" "She laughed at everything. Bad jokes, good jokes, things that weren't even jokes. She found joy in the smallest things. A bird on the fence. A crooked flower in the garden. She made life feel lighter." Simon's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "And she loved you." "Yes," Robert whispered. "She did." Simon turned to look at the painting again. The unfinished portrait of Eleanor stared back at him, her eyes warm and alive despite the rough strokes. And then Simon did something no one had ever seen him do on live television. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his eyes. The audience erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in a collective gasp of emotion. People were crying openly now. Sophia had her face in her hands. Heidi was wiping tears with a tissue. Howie was staring at Simon, his mouth slightly open in shock. Simon turned back to Robert. "Finish it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Finish the painting." Robert nodded, unable to speak. He turned back to the canvas and continued, his hands shaking but determined. Simon didn't return to the judges' table. He stayed there, standing at the edge of the stage, watching every single brush stroke. Minutes passed. The only sound was the soft scrape of brush against canvas. And then, finally, Robert stepped back. The painting was done. It wasn't a masterpiece in the technical sense. But it was a masterpiece of love. Eleanor's face looked back at them, imperfect and beautiful, a woman who had been deeply loved and deeply missed. Robert turned to Simon, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me try." Simon didn't respond with words. Instead, he did something else. He climbed onto the stage, walked over to Robert, and placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. And then, in front of millions of viewers, Simon Cowell, the man known for his harsh critiques and unshakable composure, pulled Robert into a hug. The audience exploded. People were on their feet, clapping, crying, cheering. The other judges stood as well, applauding, tears running down their faces. When Simon finally pulled away, he looked Robert in the eyes and said, "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen on this stage." Robert smiled through his tears. "She would have loved this moment." "I know she would have," Simon replied. Then Simon turned to the judges' table, his face still wet with tears, and without hesitation, he slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Golden confetti rained down from the ceiling. The audience roared. Robert stood in the center of the stage, covered in gold, holding the painting of his late wife, sobbing with a mixture of grief and joy. Simon didn't return to his seat. He stayed on stage with Robert, standing beside him as the confetti fell, as the audience cheered, as the cameras captured every second of a moment that would be replayed millions of times. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment. Because what happened after this performance is something you need to hear. Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, Simon found Robert sitting alone in a dressing room, staring at the painting. Simon knocked softly on the door. "May I come in?" Simon asked. Robert looked up, surprised. "Of course." Simon stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Simon sat down beside Robert and looked at the painting. "My father passed away a few years ago," Simon said quietly. "We had a complicated relationship. I never told him how much he meant to me. Not really. Not the way I should have." Robert nodded, understanding without needing to say anything. "When I saw you up there," Simon continued, "painting her, honoring her, I realized something. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form. And the people who keep loving after loss, they're the bravest people in the world." Robert's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't feel brave." "You are," Simon said firmly. "You got on that stage and shared your heart with the world. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done." They sat in silence for a few more moments, two men from completely different worlds, connected by the universal experience of loss and love. Finally, Simon stood and extended his hand. "Thank you, Robert, for reminding me why I do this. It's not about finding the next big star. It's about finding moments like this. Moments that matter." Robert shook his hand. "Thank you for seeing it." The episode aired 3 weeks later. Within hours, it became the most watched clip in America's Got Talent history. News outlets around the world covered the story. Social media exploded with reactions. People shared their own stories of loss, of love, of the people they'd lost and still carried with them. But more importantly, something shifted in Simon Cowell. In the episodes that followed, he was different. Still honest, still direct, but softer. More willing to see the person behind the performance. More willing to let his own humanity show. And whenever someone asked him about that night, about the moment he couldn't speak, he would smile and say, That's the night I remembered why any of this matters. Robert never pursued a career as a painter. He returned to his quiet life, to his home where Eleanor's art still hung on every wall. But he kept the painting he made that night. It hangs above the fireplace now, a testament to a love that death couldn't diminish. And sometimes, when people visit, they ask him about the golden buzzer, about Simon Cowell, about the moment that changed everything. Robert always smiles when he tells the story. Eleanor always said art isn't about perfection, he says. It's about truth. And that night, I finally understood what she meant. Some performances win competitions. This one won hearts. Share this story. Subscribe. Because love like this deserves to be remembered forever.